All right, everybody, this is our last topic for Bio 101. I hope you've had a good semester, even though it ended interestingly, to say the least. So the last topic we're going to cover is community ecology. So community ecology. A biological community is an assemblage of populations of various species living close enough for interactions between them to occur. And I've pretty much talked a lot about community ecology throughout the semester, talking about how all of these different organisms, microorganisms, plants, and animals are all interconnected to each other and work and function together as a single community. Community ecology. So community interactions. These interactions are going to be classified by whether they help, harm, or have no effect. Interspecific interactions are relationships between species within a community. So that is between different species. So that is interspecific interactions. Some examples are competition, predation, herbivory, symbioses, and facilitation. Interspecific interactions can affect the survival and reproduction of each one of those species that are involved, and the effects again can be negative, positive, or have no effect. So negative, positive, or no effect. Zero, not. So competition. Interspecific competition is a negative interaction. It occurs when species compete for a resource that is in short supply. Strong competition occurring can lead to competitive exclusion. This results in the local elimination of competing species. This is a very famous example of competitive exclusion. So we have two different types of ocean barnacles. I believe there are two different types of barnacles, I believe. And what we have here are barnacles that are found at the top and barnacles that are found that actually go into the water. So we have ones that only can get access to water during high tide and ones that have access to water all the time, including during low tide. So what scientists wanted to know is, are one of these organisms excluding the other? And so they hypothesized that it was this group that was excluding this other population up here of a different species, excluding them from growing or moving downward toward low tide ocean access. So they removed this population, and what they saw is that they were able to occupy the full range. And so this group, this species, was excluding, through competitive exclusion, excluding this group, this species, from occupying their full fundamental niche. So I just introduced another new term there, fundamental niche. So I am talking a little bit more about ecological niches, or the specific role or area or place that an organism is going to be occupying. So the full fundamental niche of the cathalmus is the entire high to low tide area. But when the balanus is present, then it has a realized niche. So the realized niche is only in the high tide areas, and the balanus realized niche is in the low to ocean tide area. But without it, then the full cathalmus fundamental niche includes the entire breadth of that. So competitive exclusion principle states that two species competing for the same resource cannot coexist in the same place. So these two are direct competitors with one another, and so neither one is capable of occupying their full fundamental niche. So ecological niches and natural selection. The total of species' use of biotic and abiotic resources is called its ecological niche. An ecological niche can also be thought of the ecological, quote, role an organism plays. Ecologically similar species can coexist in a community if there are one or more significant differences in their niches. So here we have a variety of different closely related lizard species. But each one of these lizard species occupies a different part of the wooded area. We have some that are surviving below, like lower to the ground, some that are in the mid-stage range of our tree, and then some that are found in the canopy of the tree. So each one of these lizards is occupying a different part of the niche, and so they're not competing with one another. So this is called resource partitioning. It's the differentiation of ecological niches enabling similar species to coexist in the community. We also see this with birds. So here we have a single conifer tree. And a conifer tree has a bunch of different sections. There's the center portion that has the main body, the main trunk. You have outer branches, inner branches, and mid-range branches. And different types of very similar bird species, these are all different types of warblers, are going to be occupying different parts of that tree. So our bay-breasted warbler is found in the mid-range, let's say on the south side. And then we have the black-throated green warbler, also in the mid-range of the branches, but it's found on the north side. Same with our Blackburnian warbler. It's on the outside of the branches on the south. Cape May warbler, outside of the branches, but to the north. And then you have the myrtle warbler, that its niche is in the center to the low branches of the tree. So you see, each part of the tree is occupied by a different species, and they're not competing with one another. There we go. Okay, so we have those two different types of niches. Fundamental niche and the realized niche. A species' fundamental niche is the whole niche potentially occupied by that species. So for the cathalmus, here is its entire fundamental niche. A species' realized niche is the niche actually occupied by the species. So in life, in reality, the Balanus is also present. That is its natural ecosystem. And because it's naturally there, then the cathalmus's realized niche is actually just the high tide portion. As a result of competition, a species' fundamental niche may be different from its realized niche, and that's what we see here with our different organisms. Next, we have this characteristic called character displacement. Character displacement is a tendency for characteristics to be more, quote-unquote, divergent in sympatric populations of two species when compared to allopatric. Now, there's a couple of new terms there that we haven't heard before, sympatric and allopatric. So sympatric, or sympatry, is when they are occurring in overlapping ranges. So two different species in the same overlapping range. Allopatric, or allopatry, is occurring in non-overlapping ranges. So two populations that are not overlapping. Oh, sorry. So here we have different species of finches that have character displacement of beak sizes. So insectivores and granivores, and the beaks are in this case the characteristic that is being displaced. It's what's changing in all of these different similar species of finches. Now I studied something very similar to that involves character displacement, and it was with grasshopper mice. Grasshopper mice are one of the coolest mouse species out there. I know you probably never thought you'd ever hear those words combined into a single sentence, but there you go. Grasshopper mice are unlike practically any other mouse species because they are predatory. So they actually are hunters, they are predators, and they consume mostly small invertebrates, but they can also consume small reptiles such as snakes and small lizards, and they can sometimes even prey on other smaller mice. There are 3 different species of grasshopper mice, and all 3 species use a high-frequency howl to indicate where their territory is. So that's what this guy here is doing. He's standing up on his back legs, they throw back their heads, and let out this big howl. If you actually correct for body size, so if you made this mouse the size of a wolf, it would sound like a wolf howl. Anyway, so there's 3 different species, and each 3 species have sympatric, but each species has an allopatric population, but there's one spot in the entire world where all 3 species occur together. It is the one sympatric population of all 3 species. And in that location, their vocalizations become different from one another. So you have one mouse that is slightly larger, that has a lower frequency howl, and a medium size that has a medium frequency, and then a small one that has a very high frequency howl. So it's an example of character displacement. So here is the ranges. There's the northern, the southern, and the Chihuahuan grasshopper mice. Northern even comes into Saskatchewan. The southern grasshopper mouse, and then the Chihuahuan grasshopper mouse. And this is the only spot in the entire world where all 3 are co-occurring, and it is in this one spot that they exhibit character displacement. So you have one mouse that becomes slightly larger, another one that becomes slightly smaller, and their frequency, so this is mass, so this is how big they are. So A is smallest, C is biggest, and then you have an intermediate. And this is also true for their frequencies. So the smallest mouse makes the highest frequency, the biggest mouse makes the lowest frequency, and the intermediate has an intermediate frequency. So very, very cool. And what this helps prevent, because they're all in the same, here, I don't know if you saw this, they're all in the same genus. So O period, O period, O period. This is all standing for Onychomys. They're all in the same genus, but they're 3 different species. And so what this character displacement helps is it prevents hybridization between these species. And this has been supported in my lab where I studied for my master's degree. Okay, next type of competition, predation. Predation has a positive, negative type interaction. It refers to interactions where one species kills and eats another species. Predators have very special adaptations to aid in bringing down and subduing prey. And prey has adaptations to avoid being eaten, because no one really wants to be eaten. That's not an ideal situation. So for predators, they have power, claws, teeth, stingers, venom. Prey can have speed. They can occur in herds. That's always a good anti-predator adaptation. Alarm calls to alert everybody else in the area that there's a predator around. And cryptic coloration. A really cool example of a predator-prey relationship is between this garter snake and a newt. So there is a newt in California that is the most toxic newt. I believe it's the most toxic newt in the world. Sorry, I keep coughing. If not, it's one of the most toxic. It's extremely toxic. It's actually, if you were to just extract a little bit of the toxins off of their skin, it has enough toxic power to kill 30 adult humans. So very, very, very toxic. However, the snake that they overlap ranges with, they can still eat and consume these highly toxic newts. And it's because they have co-evolved with each other for so long that as the newt became more and more toxic, the snake became more and more tolerant of those toxins. And it was this give and take battle. So some more prey adaptations. We have amazing examples of cryptic coloration. So insects have amazing types of cryptic coloration. Reptiles, like this gecko, has amazing cryptic coloration. There's aposematic coloration. This type of coloration means I am bad to eat, do not eat me. So we see this with our poison dart frogs. They are highly toxic. This little octopus here it's called I think a golf ball octopus is its name, and it is one of the most toxic critters on the entire planet. You never, ever, ever want to touch one of those. And then things like skunks. Skunks have bright black and white coloration that indicate to predators, I do something nasty. In this case, it's spraying a foul smell. Do not eat me. Next, we have Batesian mimicry. This is where they pretend to be something that is dangerous. So in this case, this is a caterpillar. This is actually a caterpillar, and this caterpillar changes the shape of its body to look like the head of a snake. Now, snakes are also commonly mimicking one another. This is a king snake. King snakes are harmless. They are absolutely harmless, but they are Batesian mimics of coral snakes. Oops. Coral snakes are highly, highly venomous. Very, very venomous. And so the king snake has evolved to mimic them to avoid being eaten by other larger predators. Then we have Mullerian mimicry. Mullerian mimicry is to imitate something that is toxic. So here we have yellow jackets, which have the ability to sting, and then we have a mimic. Monarch butterflies are actually toxic. And then we have things like our viceroy butterflies that are mimics of the monarchs. All right, so the next type of interaction is herbivory. Herbivory is another positive-negative type of interaction. It refers to an interaction in which an herbivore eats parts of a plant or algae. It leads to the evolution of plant mechanisms and chemical defenses, and therefore adaptations of herbivores in response. So plants are becoming pokier, they're becoming distasteful. Meanwhile, their herbivores are figuring out ways to deal with the spikiness or the thorns. So giraffes, for example, have evolved a very long, sticky tongue that wraps around the branches with these thorns and just strips them clean, and they don't get hurt by the thorns. All right, we talked a lot early in the semester about symbiosis. We have parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, facilitation. So we've talked a lot about these throughout the semester. So you should know what these interactions are like. So going into diversity and trophic structure. In general, a few species in a community tend to exert strong control on the overall community structure. So what this means, breaking it down, is that one species has a big influence on all of the other species. The nature of the interactions within a community depends on species composition, the number of species present, their abundances, and their feeding relationships. So species diversity of a community is the variety of organisms that make up the community. So more diversity means more different species that are there. There's two main components: species richness, the total number of different species in the community, and relative abundance. The proportion of each species represents the total individuals of the community. So in this example, community 1, we have high species richness and even abundance. So it's equal across all the species. A, B, and C, there's 25% representation for species A, B, and C, and D. So equal. In community 2, we have the same amount of species richness, because we still have 4 species, A, B, C, and D, but only one species is really abundant. So 80% of this community is of species A. So this has a high abundance of species A. So diversity and community stability. So ecologists manipulate diversity in experimental communities. An example of this is that in Minnesota, researchers have manipulated plant diversity. So this is how many different species. So they manipulated plant diversity in a nature reserve. The communities with higher diversity, so more species, were more productive and stable, were better at recovering from environmental stress, and were more resistant against invasive species. This is why when scientists, and you might hear some of these like keywords if you go out and listen to environmentalists or something and they're talking about biodiversity, this is one of the reasons why scientists know that biodiversity is extremely, extremely important to having healthy and complex ecosystems. So trophic structure. So this is kind of getting into food chains and food webs. So trophic structure is the feeding relationships between organisms in a community. It is a key factor in community dynamics. Food chains link our different trophic levels from producers, like plants, to the top carnivores. So here, our different trophic structure, our different trophic levels, are primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and quaternary consumers. So here we have the plants. The plants are, on land, terrestrial food chains, the bottom of the food chain. They are eaten by a herbivore, like an insect. That insect is eaten by, this looks like a shrew of some kind. That shrew is eaten by a snake, and the snake is eaten by a hawk. The same thing goes inside of our aquatic ecosystems. I talked a lot about phytoplankton and zooplankton, how they were some of the base of the food chains. So our phytoplankton is eaten by zooplankton. Zooplankton is eaten by small fish, and small fish are eaten by bigger fish, and the bigger fish are eaten by things like whales, like killer whales. So you can see how intimately these are going to be connected with one another. But this diagram here is putting it very, very simply. It is much, much, much more complex when you are actually talking about real-life community structures. They get messier like this. So while food chains are a great simplified way to look at it, really they're food webs. A food web is a branching food chain with complex trophic interactions. Many species play more than one role at a time on more than one trophic level. So food webs can be simplified by grouping the species with similar trophic relationships, isolating a portion of a community that interacts very little with the rest of the community. So you can see how complex this can get very, very quickly. How phytoplankton are affecting krill and copepods, how those are affecting all of these different organisms. Everyone is interconnected with one another. So this is a pretty messy one. But if we want to really piece this apart, we can start to look at the different weights of these lines. The heavier, the thicker, the darker the line is, the more important their role is, or the more intense their role is in the ecosystem. And so you can see this is for the Arctic environment, and one of the most important organisms in the Arctic of all things is the lemming, the tiny little lemming. That is because lemmings serve as one of the primary food resources for a ton of the other organisms. So they're consuming a lot, herbs and grasses and dryads and willows and mosses, and then a bunch of other things are eating these lemmings. The snowy owl, foxes, ermine, longtails, buzzards, all sorts of things are going to be consuming lemmings. So trophic structure does have limits on food chain length. Each food chain in a food web is usually only a few lengths long. There's two main hypotheses to explain food chain length. The first is the energetic hypothesis. This suggests that the length is limited by inefficient energy transfer. So the amount of energy that is produced by our primary producers is drastically reduced when it gets to our primary consumers even. We go from 10,000 joules of energy to 1,000 joules of energy. And then that is, again, decimated. Secondary consumers only get 100 joules of energy. And what that really means is that they're going to have to consume more to be sure to get the energy they need. The second is the dynamic stability hypothesis. This proposes that long food chains are less stable than short ones, because the longer the chain is, then the more likely it is that if one of those links is removed, the whole thing collapses. So species with large impacts, these are species that have a big impact on their community. So certain species have a very large impact on community structure. Such species are highly abundant or play a pivotal role in the community dynamics. A dominant species are those that are most abundant and have the most biomass. A great example of that is the good old sugar maple. They exert powerful control over the occurrence and distribution of other species, potentially better at competing for resources or possibly better at avoiding predation. Next, we have keystone species and ecosystem engineers. Keystone species exert a strong control on a community by their ecological roles or their niches. In contrast to dominant species, they are not necessarily abundant in the community. I talked about this example before with our sea otters, our kelp forests, and sea urchins. So the sea otter is considered a keystone species. That is because the sea otter population is the key to maintaining that sea urchin population. And because the sea urchin population is under control, the kelp forest can grow up. If you remove the sea otter, remove that keystone, like in an arch, so the keystone is the one that keeps the arch together. If you remove that keystone, the entire ecosystem collapses. The sea urchin population explodes, and the kelp forest is decimated. Ecosystem engineers cause a physical change in the environment that affect community structure. Now, I know a lot of people that live in rural communities or have farms are not necessarily the biggest fan of beavers, but beavers are vital ecosystem engineers. They are actively causing physical change to their environment, creating these big dams and making small ecosystems. So they are literally engineering their ecosystem. They are absolutely amazing creatures, and I know they get a bad reputation because they can ruin some farmland, but they are phenomenal animals. A really cool study came out not too long ago that was actually conducted by a good friend of mine who studied cougars and how cougars are ecosystem engineers and are keystone species. This is because when cougars have a kill, they leave that kill on the landscape, and in that small localized area, they are shaping their ecosystem. Because in that small area, they have left a carcass. That carcass has lots and lots of nutrients in it. And as it decomposes or is broken down, it's going to attract different animals, different insects, and it's gradually going to decay and then feed the plant life. And so it's actively changing the environment. So we have different types of controls when it comes to our ecosystems. We have bottom-up and top-down. The bottom-up model of community organization proposes a unidirectional influence from lower to higher trophic levels. So from the primary producers all the way up to our top predators. In this case, presence or absence of mineral nutrients can determine community structure, including the abundance of primary producers or plants. The top-down model also called a trophic cascade model, proposes that control of the food web comes from the top down. In this case, predators control the herbivores, which in turn control the primary producers. A very famous example of this is with the reintroduction of gray wolves into Yellowstone National Park in the States. The gray wolves were extirpated, they were eradicated from the park until the mid-1990s. When they were reintroduced in the 1990s, the wolf population, let me back up a second. Without the wolves, so the wolves are gone, the elk population skyrocketed. And if there's any hunters in the room, that might sound really great. However, the population got too big. It got too big and it started to destroy the rest of the ecosystem. So the elks were overpopulated. They ate down too much of the vegetation. And so it pushed out other herbivores such as beavers, birds. And because the ecosystem was changing so much, other animals were excluded, such as larger birds of prey, bears. So when the wolves were reintroduced in the mid-1990s, the wolves started to control the elk populations. But not only that, it changed the behavior of the elk. So now the populations of the elk were going down, the vegetation started to heal from all of the years of overgrazing, and other organisms started to come back into the park, and the biodiversity increased, and the ecosystem was restored. So that is there's really great videos out there of some of these of this story, the gray wolf story. I highly recommend you go and check it out. It's an amazing story and a great example of top-down trophic level ecosystem control. It's really cool. So disturbances can also influence species diversity and composition. So decades ago, most ecologists favored the view that communities are stable and in a state of equilibrium, so unchanging. This idea was challenged, and recent evidence suggests that communities are constantly changing after disturbances. This is called the non-equilibrium model. And when I'm talking about a disturbance, what I'm referring to is an event that changes a community, removes an organism from it, and alters resource availability. So this can be a tree falling down. This can be a wildfire started by a lightning storm. This could be a hurricane. All of these are different types of disturbances. So how do we characterize disturbance? There are high levels of disturbance and low, as well as all of the in-betweens. Like I've said so many times, biology and ecology are not black and white. There are all sorts of shades of gray. So fire can be a high level of disturbance. It can be very bad if the disturbance is too great. So this is an example. This is a catastrophic fire. This helps no one. This is an extreme amount of disturbance and will take a long time to heal. This is a pretty low amount of disturbance. This tree just fell over and caused a little bit of disturbance, but overall the ecosystem is intact. So high levels of disturbance can exclude slow-growing species that require a lot of time. Low levels of disturbance allow dominant species to exclude less competitive ones. In intermediate disturbance hypothesis, it suggests that moderate levels of disturbance can foster greater diversity in the ecosystem than either high or lower levels of disturbance. So a healthy ecosystem will have a moderate amount of disturbance. All right, so now we're going to get into succession. So a disturbance has happened. Ecological succession is the sequence of a community and ecosystem changes after that disturbance. Primary succession occurs when there's no soil exists. Occurs where no soil exists when succession begins. So bare rock, we have rock. Secondary succession begins in an area where soil remains after a disturbance. So secondary disturbance, we still have some soil. So we have some substance to start things growing. Ecological succession for early arriving species and later arriving species may be linked to one of three processes. Early arrivals may facilitate appearance of later species by making the environment more favorable. They may inhibit establishment of later species. So our early arrivals are stopping the arrival of later species. They may tolerate later species but have no impact on their establishment. So there's different processes that can occur. And they can all occur simultaneously or one at a time. Again, all the shades of gray and in between. A really great place to study succession is at the boundaries of glaciers. So retreating glaciers provide valuable field research opportunities for studying and observing succession. This is because as these glaciers recede, they have all of these different points that they reach. Early succession, so the pioneer stage, are dominated by certain species. You have secondary succession with other species, late succession, and terminal succession. So these are fully fledged spruce stage. So they are late after the disturbance has occurred. So it's kind of a timeline. Here we have early or very new disturbance, moderate disturbance, late disturbance, and very old disturbance. And so you have the whole range of succession right there at your glacial boundary. Humans cause all sorts of disturbance. Humans have had the greatest impact on biological communities in the entire world. Human disturbance to communities usually results in a reduction of species diversity. We see this in our oceans, we see this on islands, we see this in mountains, in plains, in prairies. Humans have disturbed everything, and we have lost a vast amount of biodiversity as a direct result of human disturbance. Biogeographic factors, so large-scale biogeographic factors and features affect community biodiversity. And what I mean by this is, where is its position on the large scale? Is it in a northern latitude? Is it on the equator? So latitude and area are two key factors that affect communities and species diversity. Latitudinal gradients, so species richness is especially great in the tropics and generally declines along an equatorial polar gradient. So you have, if this is the equator here, this is where you're going to get the most amount of species richness. So you're going to have lots of different species and lots of them, and they are going to decrease as you move toward either pole. So as you go to the poles, that richness is going to decrease. Species richness is probably affected by the evolutionary history and the climate. Temperature in polar regions have started over multiple times following glaciation. Older tropics may account for greater species richness. The growing season is much longer in the tropics, and because it's longer, more things can grow. Climate is likely the primary cause of the latitudinal gradient in biodiversity. Two main factors are correlated with the amount of biodiversity: the amount of solar energy, so how much sun it's getting, and the water availability, so how much water is falling. So here, tree species richness. So we have more species richness on our Y, and evapotranspiration. So this is the amount of rain. So here, very little rain, very little species richness. Lots of rain, lots of species richness. So here we have vertebrate species richness and potential evapotranspiration. So again, this is like how much rain there is. Not a lot of rain, not a lot of diversity. Lots of rain, lots of richness, lots of diversity. So that's great. So both of those factors can be considered together by measuring community's evapotranspiration rate. And that's kind of what I just went over. Because evapotranspiration is kind of a combination of both the amount of solar energy and the water availability. So so we're talking about the evaporation of water. The more sun there is, the more water that's going to be evaporated. So it's a combination of both water and solar energy. Area effects. The species area curve quantifies the idea that all other factors being equal, so everything else is equal, a larger geographic area will have more species. It kind of makes intuitive sense. A species area curve of North America breeding birds supports this hypothesis. So we have number of species and area. And what we have is that as area increases, the amount of bird species increases. The island equilibrium model. So species richness on islands depends on island size, the distance from the mainland, immigration, and extinction. The equilibrium model of island biogeography maintains that species richness on ecological island levels off at a dynamic equilibrium point. Again, there's a bunch of figures here. I'm not going to test you on like the specifics of these diagrams, but what I just kind of wanted to like hit home here is that larger islands are going to have more species richness. Larger islands closer to the mainland will have larger species richness. Larger islands farther away from the mainland will have smaller species richness. And the same goes for small. Like small islands are going to have less than large islands. If you're a small island far away from the mainland, then you're going to have pretty low species richness.